Absolutely. Thank you very much, Dirk. So you've already introduced me. I'm Stevan Lee. I'm in the research and evidence part of DFID. So first of all, thanks very much to the panelists for that very interesting and informative discussion we've just had. I'm not sure if it gets really interesting now. It might do for a subset of the audience because I'm going to be introducing DECARP, which is our new and open for proposals research project. It's supposed to be generating research proposals which speak to quite a few of the issues that the panel have just been talking about. So let me go on to that. So yes, it's called the Department of International Development and Economic and Social Research Council's China-Africa Research Programme, or DECARP. And so we must not forget the Economic and Social Research Council, who's a key partner in this, an equal partner with DFID, a financial partner, and a partner in terms of human contribution and organising the thing. Dan's here from ESRC and is going to talk after me, so I'm not going to say much more about ESRC, but they're a very valued part of this. I'm from DFID, Department for International Development. It's the British government's international development ministry, government department. We've just met our target of spending 0.7% of GDP in net aid last year. We've got a central research budget of approximately £300 million a year at the moment. There's a bit more spent through regional offices, but that's the context. And then the growth research, part of that's about 10% at the moment, about 30 million a year. And that's managed by my team. The sort of unifying question for the research which is done under our team is why are some countries persistently up to 100 times poorer than the leading economies in the world? We're interested in low-income to middle-income transitions, what stops them, why do they happen, what happens when they happen. And then I've listed some of the aspects that we've got research programs pertaining to, so institutions of political economy, and then other factors like macroeconomy, the financial sector, the labour market, gender, firms, agriculture, cities, infrastructure, and we have a programme on rising powers, which is sort of global issues, but really it's about the lessons from the development experience of Brazil, China, possibly some other BRICS or mints, and also the experience for Africa in interacting with Brazil, China, and possibly some other countries. So generally in DFID research we are concerned about an audience which is decision makers in low-income countries. I say decision makers because it's partly politicians and policymakers in the government, but also dissenting voices, people who might put pressure on the government or be in the government in the future. We want to inform them as well. Also external actors, of whom DFID is one, but only a subcomponent of that part of the audience. For DECARP, by the way, that means that we're primarily not primarily talking about a Chinese audience, we're talking about an African audience. So we're talking about decision makers from Africa, what can they learn from the Chinese experience, or how should they respond to China's interactions in Africa. So again, generally in DFID, the way we commission research is in bulk, so we don't do individual research proposals. We have to come up with programs that are going to, at another level, identify particular pieces of research, and there's varied ways of doing that, but all of them are based on principles of trying to generate research excellence. So we're very interested in actually things being published in peer-reviewed journals, that quality of research, and that's a requirement. We want to have competition and openness. We want to have, we believe we'll get better quality and value for money by going for models which incorporate those. And yeah, so we want publication in peer-reviewed journals to demonstrate quality. I mean, we look at that individually, but in bulk, we have to take that as a signal. But really, because of the audience that I've just described, we put a major emphasis on engagement with policymakers, and research uptake activities is the word that we use, aimed at conveying the findings of research and balanced evidence in an accessible way for the decision makers that I just described. That is well beyond publication in peer-reviewed journals. Okay, so the first part of the Rising Powers program is on Brazil. So obviously Brazil is Brazil Africa, by the way. So Brazil is a very different from Africa now and in history. You know, Portuguese settler colony, very specific institutions to do with royalty and that history. Maybe a bit more like Africa. It's got huge land to labour ratio and is pretty remote from the rest of the world. So aspects of Brazil's development experience could be very interesting and relevant for Africa, and this programme, this part of the Rising Powers programme looks at that, and is also very interested in the fact that Brazil is now interacting with Africa much more than in any but the most recent history, and exploring whether there are special characteristics for that. So if you bear in mind we're talking about an African audience, it's important for that African audience to know whether they should react to Brazilian investors or exporters in a particular way, or whether they should be treated as part of the wider group. So that project is differently organised from Descartes, which I'll explain in a moment. That's a single consortium led by Manchester University. The first phase, they're doing some review papers that should be very interesting and be done fairly quickly, but they're all prescribed in a terms of reference. And then the second phase is being developed by the first phase. Look at some more questions. The second part of the Rising Powers project is what we're talking about today in more detail, and what we'll have questions and answers on, I guess, will be. China and Africa. So like Brazil, you know, China's extremely different from Africa now and in history. It's a very old nation, very specific institutions, therefore, applying in China or evolved in China. It's got a low land to labour ratio, and it's also clearly very large, and therefore in some sense the centre of things, or one of the centres of things, can't be described as remote, because it's one of the sort of global concentrations of population, markets, so forth. So, are there aspects of China's development experience which could be very interesting and relevant for Africa? I think there are. I think we were told in earlier consultations, partly by Professor Kaplinsky actually, that it would be good to start, you know, to think of this in terms of challenges that Africa faces, and whether there's anything about the Chinese experience which is relevant to that. So I don't think anybody expects the Chinese experience to be repeated in Africa, as was also said just now in the discussion, completely. And so we're not really interested in research proposals which just describe what's happened in China, because there's not an implication that will necessarily happen anywhere else. But if we think about challenges that there are in Africa, there are Chinese experiences which could be very useful. So if there is an African country which is worried about having unproductive and uncommercial, low productivity agriculture, perhaps China's experience with liberating and marketising, commercialising agriculture would be of interest. Or if there's an African country is thinking about how to organise urbanisation and perhaps promote rural development to balance urbanisation, or make urbanisation work in a different way than they're seeing at the moment, then perhaps China may have some clues to how that might be done. Or if there's an African country where there's a big of a grey area between the public sector and the private sector, which doesn't seem to be producing very good outcomes at the moment, where they prefer it to produce some good outcomes in terms of generating productive investments, maybe China has some clues. I mean, there's a long list, but that's the kind of thing that we're going for in terms of proposals. And then possibly more importantly, I mean, we'll have to see, but there's more emphasis on this in the core specification, which is that, you know, China, as we've just been discussing, China is now interacting with Africa much more than in the past. How should that African audience that we described react to that? So a big question is are there special characteristics about China? How important is it, but also is it different from other actors? So, you know, it's a new direct investor. It's a direct investor, to some extent a portfolio investor and financer. It's a donor on an increasing basis. It's a supplier or exporter and a customer. And then there could be special characteristics about China and Africa in all those roles. It could be that it's more different now than it's going to be, and it's beginning to converge, and so those are the things that have to be explored. But this is all from the perspective of the African decision maker. Do I have to treat China differently? Do I have to have a special China policy, or is this just like the OECD or like other BRICS? So the project is open at the moment. There's a call that's open at the moment for proposals. Dan's going to tell us more about how that works, but it's organised by DFID and ESRC. It's open until March the 13th. We're keen to receive proposals from collaborators with African and Chinese expertise. Doesn't necessarily mean Chinese people or African people, but it does mean I think there's an interest in generating proposals which are from groups of researchers with both sorts of expertise. And I think I've repeated this quite a few times, but the proposals must be relevant to this African audience I've been talking about, not just descriptions or analyses of China's experience. I said that already, so I won't repeat that more. I think that's the end of my presentation.
All right.
Over to you.
Thank you, Stevan. So that's been very good to have a top-line overview of the research programs, DFID, and then to see how the program fits in, and also to get a better understanding of your demands in terms of this program.